Hey everyone, my name is Scruffy. Today we are looking into the final boss of the first raid in the War Within, Queen Ansurek. This is a theoretical guide, using all the information that we already have about this boss. It has not been tested on the PTR, but we already know quite a bit about her already. Last season, we did the same with Firak in Amirdrasil and published a preliminary guide for him with all the infos we had, and it came out quite close to reality. Therefore, we are doing the same today for Queen Ansurek. If you like these type of guides, you can find the whole playlist for all bosses in the Nerubar Palace here on my YouTube, as well as dungeon guides, and for all other guides like class guides, you can visit yourmmo.com. If you think, after watching this video, that I would deserve your subscription, please consider hitting that sub button. And without further ado, let's hop into Queen Ansurek. Let's look into the boss room first, and a few explanations here. This is the whole encounter area for Queen Ansurek. We see 2 middle platforms and a few on the side as well. The important ones are these with a stepping stone, like an additional platform for players to land on. For our guide, it does not really matter if the boss fight starts on the top platform or bottom one. The boss fight has 3 phases and 1 intermission after the first phase. After phase 1 and the intermission, Queen Ansurek ascends to her private chambers, which might be the top platform or the bottom one, but it doesn't really matter. We are today assuming that it starts in the bottom platform, and we have a certain jump pad mechanic later that launches us to the platform, similar to Dafea in the Vaults of Incarnates. Let's start with the basic mechanics of this fight. Throughout phase 1, Accurate Presence will deal damage every 3 seconds to all players and is a basic healer mechanic. Web blades are projectiles shooting through the arena, targeting a few certain players. This deals damage to players in their path and is probably similar to Zakara's meteor that travels across the room, indicated by an arrow from the edges of the room. Make sure to aim these away from other players. 2 tank abilities have to be dealt with in this fight. Feast will deal damage to the tank and apply a large heal absorb on them. In Heroic, the heal absorb is increased by the amount of damage this ability has dealt to the tank. Tank should not taunt off after this ability, and it just has to be mitigated and healed off. Liquefy is the ability that tanks will have to switch aggro. She attacks the current tank with a large magic damage and applying a debuff on the tank for 30 seconds. This deals periodic damage and increases the tank's damage taken by 240%. Additionally, the boss splashes some green swirls around her, and they will explode on impact and leave an acid pool on the floor. For this reason, we make sure that after every tank switch, we move the boss a bit further and coordinate where these void zones spawn. Remember the roots from Tindral and Amirdrasil? Silken Tomb will root all players after a few seconds and deal damage to other players within 2 yards around of each other. This part is absolutely similar to Tindral. In Heroic Queen Ansurek, this will leave a void zone below each root that has been destroyed. So, not just the tanks and melees are traveling around the room and coordinate the void zones, but also the rangers. Coming to the complicated part of this fight. Venom Nova is a cast that deals damage to players within 8 yards of the boss. Afterwards she shoots a halo, a large growing ring that travels across the room, similar to bosses like Razagav. This slows players heavily and deals heavy damage on them, most likely killing players that are coming into contact with them. To avoid dying to this, we need a way to jump over this ring. The other complicated mechanic is Reactive Toxin. Several players receive a green circle around them, dealing damage to other players within that range. Upon expiration, they spawn Reactive Froth. Just imagine this like a void zone. When a player comes into contact with that void zone, it will be triggered like a bomb and explode after a few seconds. Afterwards, it slowly respawns to the Froth, the initial void zone. This explosion deals damage to players, applies a debuff on them to deal damage over time, but also knocking the players up. Another thing is that if Venom Nova hits this void zone, it will explode and wipe the raid. So after triggering it, it will not explode by Venom Nova and just spawn an acid pool that you already know. So when Queen Ansurek starts casting Venom Nova, make sure that your whole group runs towards the Froth, have 1 volunteering player triggering it, and then everyone places themselves in it, get knocked, and we avoided all deadly mechanics of this ability now, because the Froth will also now despawn. Just after getting knocked, make sure to spread out in Heroic, because you deal damage around yourself in a 3-yard radius. The player that triggered the bomb can no longer trigger it for 3 minutes in Heroic mode, and the debuff that it applies to said player will be reduced in damage by the amount of players getting knocked up, making this a huge mistake to accidentally running into it in Heroic mode, but forgiving in normal mode. After a certain time, let's say 70% health, the intermission starts, like at Firak. She creates a large absorb shield, connects all players with threats to her, and do some dumb shit. The threats that are attached to players deal damage to players, that just has to be compensated by your healers. In Heroic though, this damage splashes to other people within 3 yards, so here as well you want to spread out for at least 3 yards. She sometimes pulls on the strings of some players, trying to draw them into her, causing the player to be instantly killed. If you are targeted by this yank, make sure to run away from the boss. In the meantime, the boss uses Paralyzing Venom, which causes players to take 10% more damage from getting pulled in, and slowing all players by 5% per stack. This cast also spawns some toxic waves that have to be dodged. After breaking the shield, the boss crawls up to her private platform and you will encounter now ads on the side platforms. During this phase, her threats on all players continue, sometimes pulling them inwards in her direction, like in the intermission, so make sure to not get knocked off the platform. She shoots some acid bolts on random players and also casts acidic resonance. This is currently, according to Wowhead, a 45 seconds cast, and when she finishes it, you're wiped. Reaching the upper platform will cause her to stop casting this. To reach the upper platform, we do have a knock-up ability, like during Darfea again in the Vault of the Incarnates. 2 Ascended Void Speakers will spawn. Both of them share their health pool, but if they come too close to each other, they become immune to damage. As soon as they die, they will explode and knock away all players. Because they share their health pool, this will happen for both sides at the same time. In the meantime, it casts Shadow Blast to deal heavy damage to a player, but can be interrupted. It also spawns gloom mobs frequently around itself that eject after a few seconds in a random direction, dealing damage to players struck. The other ads are fairly simple. Caustic Skitterers will apply a damage taken increase on the tank for 3 seconds, and this can stack, so make sure to stun these little ads. Chamber Expeller teleports around and launches a laser beam towards one player that deals damage to all players struck in its path. Chamber Guardians deal heavy damage to the tanks, but there's one more annoying ad per side. The Devoted Worshipper will cast Cosmic Resonance when they reach low life, like 30%, and deal deadly damage to all players in 150 yards, so it has to be killed before it finishes this cast. Gloom Touch is a magic debuff randomly applied to a few players sometimes. Dispelling this debuff deals damage to all players within 100 yards, so it probably applies to both sides, no matter how you split your group. Dispelling this has to be coordinated and might become really difficult in Heroic. Thankfully, this explosion does not happen in normal mode. Make sure to kill all small ads and then finish the big ad to get knocked up into Queen Ansurek's final platform. We have similar abilities as in phase 1, just altered with cosmic energy. Web Blades are the same projectiles flying from the outside as in phase 1. Gorge is one of the 2 tank abilities. Queen Ansurek attacks 5 times within 2 seconds, dealing heavy damage to the tank and applying a damage taken increase debuff on them. This time, there's no heal absorb, but instead every attack of her will deal damage to the whole raid. In Heroic, this damage on the group increases by 25% of the damage the tank took, making this the same as the Razagav tank mechanic, where tanks have to use a strong cooldown, otherwise the raid wipes. Most likely right after this ability, she uses the other tank ability, Infest. This deals shadow damage to the tank and creates a debuff for 5 seconds on them. After 5 seconds, the tank explodes and deals damage to players within 15 yards, but also spawns Gloom Hatchlings. These ads run towards the boss and explode and give the boss a buff if they reach her. Make sure to bring this debuff far away and stun and kill these ads quickly. In Heroic, they leave gloom on the floor, just the basic Void Zone. Then in this phase, several players will receive the Royal Condemnation debuff. This marks these players and then drop a spike onto them. This deals damage to your whole raid, but the impact damage is reduced by the distance to these spikes, so the affected players need to run far away. In Heroic, this impact will cause all players to be shackled. You have to destroy these shackles to free all players, and if a player touches these shackles, they are stunned until they are destroyed. Imagine this like Sylvanas and her chains during the first intermission. She also sometimes spawns an ad, the Summoned Acolyte. This ad consecutively casts Null Detonation, dealing damage to all players and increasing in its damage for each successful cast. This has to be always interrupted. But before you can interrupt it, it has an Absorb shield that has to be nuked off. In Heroic, this ad leaves an essence when it dies. This essence can be picked up by a player and destroy Abyssal Conduits with it. So what are Abyssal Conduits? Like in the first phase, a few players get a debuff that is indicated by a circle around them. Upon expiration, this spawns Abyssal Conduits. Those are gateways that players can use to teleport from one to another. When the player with the essence from the ad walks into the conduit, it will be destroyed and explodes, launching some swirls into players that have to be dodged. In Heroic, these swirls will happen all the time, as long as the teleporters are open. In Normal though, the teleporters will despawn after a while, and in Heroic, you have to destroy them manually. That's what the essence is used for. The player that picked up the essence from the ad should not do it anymore afterwards, because they take a 1000% damage increase of it. So last but not least, the Halo Ring of her. Frothing Gluttony is again a circle traveling across the room, but this time from the outside into the boss. And this time, she pulls all players into her and killing every player that is within 20 yards of the boss. This pull in of her will be stronger over time, and of course, you want to not touch that purple ring that comes towards you. To avoid all of this, you have to teleport from one teleporter to another. While teleporting, you are immune to all these effects. Just be aware that if one of the ads is still alive during this, it will also cause deadly damage to players. And in Heroic, the essence must not be hit by the purple halo, Otherwise, the same thing happens. So, a lot of deadly one-shot abilities and complicated coordination. An interesting start into the expansion. Remember that this is data from the current dungeon journal and all of it is subject to change. Use this video as a sneak peek of what this boss fight will be and have a good start into the next expansion.